All right. Welcome everyone to our first of two Reed Fink Awards in Southern Labor History Talks. Today our presentation is on documenting Georgia's underdocumented Hispanic communities from 1986 to 1988. This award honors Dr. Reed and Dr. Fink for their contributions to education, labor studies, and the Southern Labor Archives. Fellowships of at least $250 are awarded annually to individuals whose research in the Southern Labor Archive will lead to a book, article, dissertation, or other product. Our speaker today is Libia Jimenez Chavez, who is a first-generation immigrant scholar and a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Georgia. She graduated from the University of Rochester with a double bachelor's degree in political science and philosophy. She holds a master's degree in human rights from the University College London, in addition to certifications in project management, development policy, fundraising, and Latin American studies. Her research interests include transnational histories, processes of placemaking, and the relationship between race, belonging, and immigration status. She has extensive experience in the nonprofit and higher education sectors, working alongside underrepresented students. So please join me in welcoming Libia. And I'll turn it over to you. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll make sure to ask them at the end.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa. First of all, can everybody see my screen? Is everything looking good? Yes, great. Thank you. I'm not on mute as I usually am. All right, so I'm Libya. Thank you for being with me today. I really appreciate your time and joining to learn a little bit more about my research. I also want to thank Georgia State University, Southern Labor Archives, and the Reed Fink Award for supporting my work and allowing me the opportunity to be here and to share it with a wider audience. And I want to thank Lisa Vallon and Lydia Brown, the amazing archivists at Georgia State, who have extended their time, their expertise, their patience, and helped me navigate the very impressive and completely digitized AFL-CIO collection. So thank you. All right, so before we dig in to my presentation, I want to address something you've probably already noticed, and that is that my title is slightly different than what was, originally on the event title, and that's not Lisa's fault. That's all me, and that was because I just my presentation really changed, right? As you all know, if you're historians and researchers, my focus and my intention just shifted as I was in the archive and I was looking at the sources and they were, kind of speaking to me and I was able to review their content and that analysis. But my presentation will still focus on the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So IRCA, also known as the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, as it was going through Congress, which will eventually became the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, was the first comprehensive overhaul of U.S. immigration law since 1965 with the Immigration and Nationality Act, aka Hart-Celler, which abolished national origin quotas and replaced them with labor-based market skills and preferences for families of U.S. citizens. So IRCA sought to resolve existing and future undocumented migration by, one, enacting employer sanctions for the hiring of undocumented workers, making it illegal for the first time at the national level to hire unauthorized workers. Two, by increasing funding for immigration control at the border and in the interior. Three, by creating the H-2 guest worker program. And four, authorizing the legalization program that included the pre-1982 group and the SAW Special Agricultural Worker Group. So these are really just the big picture, the highlights. ARCA did a lot more than this, but this is really the meat and potatoes of the law, if you will. So then pre-1982 group for legalization were those individuals that could prove that they had resided in the United States continuously since January 1, 1982, whereas the agricultural workers had to prove that they had worked in agriculture for at least 90 days in the years between 1984 and 1986, or just 1986. And before we get into the details, I want to just take a step back and look at the very broad question that brought me to this presentation that's going to guide our talk today. And that is, what factors motivated labor organizations specifically? So I'll focus on the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Labor, and Congress of Industrial Organizations to be involved in IRCA's legalization program. And how I arrived at this question, at this topic, it was really in DC a few months ago when I was at the National Archives. I was looking through some of the 100th Congress legislative files and the conversations between Senator Alan Simpson, who was one of the architects of IRCA, and his counsel, Dig Day, who was the counsel for the Senate Subcommittee on Immigration and who worked very closely on IRCA and very closely with Senator Simpson. So in this memo dated February 27th, 1987, just a few months before the legalization window opened, he's making a claim. So Dick Day is making this claim that unions are using legalization to capitalize on a new pool of potential immigrants. And that made me wonder if, that was in fact their motivation. More broadly, what was the union, the AFL-CIO, their members and other unions, what did their legalization have on the ground work look like? What did those efforts mean for them? And did it in effect raise the membership rolls as Dig Day is claiming? And I try to answer this question in the context of the US South, not only because it's the region that I focus on, but because I found it particularly interesting given that union membership and Hispanic presence in the region has historically been lower in numbers than in other regions of the country. But as you might have guessed from my presentation title and what I've shared so far, I was not able to bring the region into my analysis. And that was really because the sources just did not speak to the topic. And for those of you who study Latinx, Hispanic, or other underrepresented groups, you know that these gaps in the archive are common and they're frankly just unfortunately part of the process. So for a variety of reasons, including the underrepresentation of diverse perspectives, the changing identity labels of Chicano, Hispanic, Spanish origin, Latinx, etc., also make it difficult to follow Latin American individuals and groups through the archive. There's also language barriers, systemic barriers, a lot of things that just did not allow me to have the access that I needed to be able to bring in that regional context. But I was happy to see that Georgia State and their archives have invested significant resources over the past few years to fill these gaps, including the Beaufort Highway and Immigrant Oral History projects, the 9 to 5 Atlanta Working Women's Records, the United Farm Workers of America Atlanta Office Records, just to name a few. And of course, supporting my work and other researchers like me that allow us to get a deeper look into what already exists in their archive. So my earlier question in the memo by Dig Day led me to more questions, right, as research often does, and leading me to these slightly less broad questions, which is the first, did IRCA's legalization processes involve and change the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations? And two, if so, was the Federation's view of and relationship to underdocumented labor one of the ways that it changed? And before we dig into the details and perhaps answering that question or partially answering those questions, I want to emphasize that the AFL-CIO's posture toward immigration policy and underdocumented labor shifted throughout the 20th century and even included divisions and shifts within its affiliate groups. So for the sake of time, I want to just begin at the 1955 merger between the AFL and the CIO in 1955. So this merger happens in addition to George Meany taking the presidency and making immigration a top priority for the Federation. Those efforts kind of come to fruition in 1963 through the ending of the Bracero program, which abolished that guest worker program was with support from the Federation. In 1965, the Hart-Celler Act is passed, so the Federation lobbies against the abolishment or about lobbies to abolish the national origin quota system and passes the Hart-Celler Act. And then throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, they supported legislation on employer sanctions. However, through the same period, so the 1970s and the 1980s, its members were also split on the issue of underdocumented workers. So in the 1970s, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union encouraged underdocumented laborers to unionize, and in 1980, their president, Sol Chaikin, called for the end of the AFL-CIO's policy that endorsed employer sanctions. Later, the Council for Latin American, the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement, the LCLAA, went back and forth on the question of illegal aliens. So at their first national membership meeting in 1975, they endorsed more stringent enforcement and monitoring of existing immigration laws, while also advocating for employer sanctions. That same year, sort of very surprisingly, I would say, they also called for ethnic unity and kind of put aside the issue of legal status. But by 1984, at their fifth annual meeting, they called to organize the unorganized, referring specifically to undocumented laborers while standing by the Federation's official position in favor of employer sanctions through the 1980s. So by the time 1986 comes around, IRCA becomes law, right? Legalization is passed, employer sanctions is passed, more Border Patrol funding is passed. The guest worker program is also passes. A lot of these came to fruition because of the AFL and its other members within its, not only within its union universe, but as well as other affiliates such as the United States Catholic Conference, the ACLU, and others that were in a coalition advocating for certain provisions within IRCA. So the final bill did include a lot of these policy preferences. So not everything. Obviously, guest workers AH2 program did pass, which the AFL-CIO stood against. But overall, the coalition was very successful in securing many of its agenda points. Looking specifically at the legalization program that changed the status of nearly 2.7 million underdocumented people. So this was a national program that ran between May of 1987 and May of 1988, with the Immigration and Naturalization Service drafting the regulations, supervising the application process, overseeing the educational campaign, and other key aspects of the program. Going back to our timeline, deviated a little bit there. I wanted to give you that 1986 IRCA context. By the 1990s, members such as the International Ladies Garment Workers Union continue advocating for immigrant workers through the Immigration Project, which lobbied against, for instance, California's Proposition 187. By 2000, we see the reversal of the policy that endorsed and supported employer sanctions, with it being replaced with Resolution 5, which called for general amnesty and for the end of employer sanctions. And by 2003, we see the Immigrant Workers Freedom Ride, which was a mass mobilization of both union and non-union documented, underdocumented laborers traveling across the country to reach DC to help pass amnesty legalization program in 2003. So that is the general timeline, but in looking specifically at the 1980s, a good place to start is the report of the Select Commission on Refugee and Immigration Policy, also known as SCRIP, which was published in March of 1981. By August of that same year, the Federation, so the AFL-CIO, called for an overhaul of immigration reform. In its 1981 statement by the Executive Council on Immigration Reform, it pledged its involvement in passing immigration reform that was, quote, humane, compassionate, consistent with the needs and aspiration of American workers, end quote. Specifically, it positioned itself as an advocate of what we've mentioned already, right? Employer sanctions, a kind of proof system of identification, greater border control, and greater resources for the INS, and it promoted the idea of legalization for those that had been in the country long enough. Between 1981 and 1986, the Federation lived up to its 1981 promise through the many iterations of the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, which, as mentioned, became IRCA. Jane O'Grady led a lot of these efforts. She was the organization's chief lobbyist, and she worked and organized extensively to pass such policies as employer sanctions and a generous legalization program, and to oppose the H-2 guest worker program. And once IRCA became law in 1986, the AFL-CIO continued its work by shaping the bill's implementation. It extended its work with the National Council of La Raza, United States Catholic Conference, the American Civil Liberties Union, and other partners that formed part of a coalition to influence legalization's regulations in the months after President Reagan's signature. So the Federation and its coalition partners were particularly interested in influencing the rules and the funding available to qualified designated entities. So these are QDEs, and they were organizations vetted and approved by INS to file legalization applications. They also wanted to sway the definition of continuous residence. They wanted it to be broad, a broad interpretation to ensure that brief, casual, and innocent absences or leaves from the country would not disqualify applicants. They wanted a family separation policy that was uniform and that deferred deportation for individual ineligible spouses and children. They wanted the documentation that proved eligibility, so documentation around residency, income, medical documentation. They wanted that to be judged on relevance and on credibility, and that the standards should not be overly harsh. On the public charge aspect, they wanted applicants to be disqualified only if they themselves received public assistance and not be disqualified if their, for instance, citizen children were the ones that had received the aid. And they wanted to expand the application deadline and to expand the program to include immigrants that arrived before January 1st, 1982. And these were just some of the regulations and some of the interpretations of the law that they wished to influence. And while these are the highlights and only some, overall, the coalition was actually pretty successful in influencing the program's regulations. So as the Federation pamphlet describes here, so describing Americans' unions as joining in an unprecedented outreach campaign in the Hispanic community and in the nation's workplaces to help undocumented workers attain legal status and prevent discrimination by employers. So this time and the activities that passed between November of 86 and May of 87, that should say 87, May 87, the legalization, right? This time and all these activities were really unprecedented as the pamphlet and this quote describe. The INS and QEDs and other interest parties had only 6 months between November and 86 and May of 87 to agree on the regulations, to assemble programmatic infrastructure, including the hiring of training of staff, purchasing of equipment, and opening service centers. On the applicant side of things, the process to attain legal status for the pre-1982 group was only available for a one-year window between Cinco de Mayo, so 5th of May of 1987 through May 4th of 1988, thereby giving the government and the immigrant communities only 1 year to outreach, to educate, to mobilize, to process millions of undocumented individuals' applications. At this stage of the process, so before the legalization window opened and even before it closed, no one really knew how many applications they were to expect. Estimates varied between 2 and 5 million. And on the applicant side of things, right, they had the very daunting task of deciphering the complex and often hostile immigration system that they had been avoiding for years. The application process was convoluted and it was quite surreal. In this, sort of twilight zone moment, the INS was asking underdocumented individuals to show documentary evidence of continuous lawful presence. Until IRCA passed, underdocumented individuals were dedicating significant energy to being undetected, to being unnoticed by the very people who now sought to embrace them. And what must have felt quite sudden, quite shocking, they were asked to prove that they were in fact living and contributing to the United States as productive individuals of good moral character. But gathering the necessary documentation was only part of the process. Applicants had to learn of and trust the program, and importantly, find an honest source of help. Even if applicants were fortunate enough to learn about the law and find adequate guidance, they still face significant barriers to legality, beginning with understanding the requirements, locating the appropriate paperwork, and gathering the filing fees, just to name a few. QDEs and other organizations like the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement, the LCLAA, and Catholic Social Services across the country filled these critical gaps. They educated the public, mobilized the community, built partnerships, instilled credibility in the program, and other essential duties. UD legalization efforts involved some AFL-CIO members, as I've mentioned, but specifically the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union, the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union, the Service Employees International Union, and others developed legalization programs throughout the country to support the effort. The ILGWU, so International Ladies Garment and Service Employees International Union, became qualified designated entities and were thereby authorized by the INS to file applications on their behalf. Others, like the Labor Council, made it their mission to inform and to guide applicants through the process. This union was established in 1973 to increase Hispanic influence within the labor movement. It positioned itself as a trusted source of information for Spanish-speaking applicants, both union and non-union. Specific to legalization, it created the LCLLA Amnesty Assistance Package, which included a 60-minute professionally developed Spanish videotape. It's called Talk to Someone You Can Trust. There's also a 12-page brochure and a 4-page newsletter and a large 11 by 17 posters that were printed and distributed throughout their chapters, which were mostly in the West, in the Southwest of the United States. The video Talk to Someone You Can Trust premiered in 3 cities in May 1987 in DC, Los Angeles, and Miami. So throughout the application window, the Labor Council positioned itself as being at the forefront of the trade union effort. This was likely due to the high number of applicants that they expected to be Spanish speakers from Latin America. As you can see from the document, the marketing material suggests that their leadership had a genuine understanding of the Latin American communities, their challenges, and their needs. For example, their materials detail who should be trusted, and they break down each step of the very convoluted process for legalization. The materials were also available in English and in Spanish. They stress the importance of completing the application with the help of a union, a community organization, a trusted lawyer. They, really anticipated kind of these needs and did a lot of troubleshooting of what information would be needed and how it should be presented to the Immigration Service. They were also critical of INS and believed that the agency did a poor job of informing and educating the public on the program. And so they saw themselves as key to the success of this program, really filling in those gaps that the INS was not able to fill. So you have seen that the Federation, the AFL-CIO affiliated unions, specifically the LCLA, raised funds. They launched educational campaigns, among other activities, to further the legalization efforts. But why? So was it the case, as Dig Day proposed, that legalization drives were an avenue for increasing member rolls, right, in a moment in U.S. history where labor membership had been declining for decades? And my interpretation is that the Federation and some of its members saw legalization as an opportunity to assimilate underdocumented people not only into American society, but into U.S. labor standards. By drawing thousands of non-union immigrant workers into their sphere of influence, they recruited new members and identified new leaders. The pamphlet, the New Immigration Law, commissioned by then AFL-CIO President Lane Kirkland, gives a sense of the union's position and goals. Its Organization and Field Services Director, Charles McDonald, anticipated a, quote, new spurt in organizing as workers became free from intimidation by employers and threat of being reported to immigration authorities, end quote. He also believed that the union's efforts would lead to a, quote, reservoir of goodwill for the trade union movement, end quote. For these reasons, the legalization served as a bridge between the labor movement and formerly underdocumented immigrants. The AFL-CIO leadership seemed to also view its participation in legalization as part of a larger mandate to further civil rights and the American tradition of immigration. The brochure compares the legalization drives to the earlier work of the Lady Garment Workers Union in helping earlier generations of Europeans become Americans. And further, the ACLAA and the AFL-CIO leaders seemed to coincide that legalization was an opportunity for increasing their political, social, and economic clout. In late 1987, LCLA President Jack Otero met with President Kirkland to discuss, quote, issues important to both Hispanics and organized labor, end quote. In their meeting, the two reflected on the growing importance of Hispanics in both the nation and the labor movement. So in conclusion, organizations like the Labor Council for the Advancement of Latin American Advancement and the Federation, they wanted immigrants to see labor unions as allies. By providing legal advice, information in Spanish, recognizing underdocumented labor's right to organize. By all of these activities and positions, they were positioning themselves as placemaking organizations where immigrants could find not only employment-related support, but also community. Union halls could be places for participation, organization, and integration into American citizenship. Okay, so this brings us to the end of my presentation, but in many ways, it's really the beginning of new research avenues. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to contextualize these sources and these findings within the U.S. South or within Georgia, and I was really looking to focus on a local chapter of the LCLA, the Federation of the International Lady Garments Union, whether it's a local chapter or a state chapter. But I wasn't able to do that. But what is needed to do that, and you all probably know this, you're probably more seasoned researchers than I am, And that's to continue collecting, processing, and recognizing union activity in the South at the end of the 20th century. And we can do this by identifying government's documentation, internal strategy, guidelines, public statements, membership data, and hopefully we can illuminate and answer if the Federation and its affiliated unions changed tactics in the South in the 1980s, 1990s in response to membership and population diversification in the US South, resulting from the rise in newly legalized immigrants through IRCA, as well as the rise in underdocumented laborers, since IRCA really failed at ending underdocumented flows, as well as considering how the presence and the potential influence of constituency groups such as the Labor Council, what their role might have been in that 2000 reversal of policy with Resolution 5, where the AFL-CIO ended its endorsement of employer sanctions and called for a general amnesty. And I hope that we can do this in the context of, like I mentioned, a local chapter, a state chapter, or even just the region. So I hope that you have taken something useful from this presentation and that we can now open the floor for a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was such a great presentation. If folks have questions, feel free to drop it in the chat, or you can unmute and ask while we give people a chance to put questions in the chat. I'll go ahead and ask one. With the Lady Garment Workers and the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement, they supported immigrants and undocumented laborers at a time when other unions didn't. Can you discuss their similarities and differences in their approach towards immigrant laborers?
Absolutely, yeah. It's complicated, right? So similar to the AFL-CIO, whose position shifted throughout the 20th century, the same thing within the Labor Council and the International Lady Garments Union. Really, the support or the lack of support that they were able to extend depended on their local chapter and their local contexts. So, for instance, the International Ladies Garment Union in New York, right? They launched the Immigration Project in 1983, where other chapters in other parts of the country didn't necessarily do that. And then for the in comparing and contrasting that to the Labor Council, they were a lot more conservative in comparison to the International Lady Garments Union, who really did a lot more organizing and believed in the right to organize of all laborers in, like I mentioned, certain chapters. And they were a lot more militant. They took to the streets to do this, whereas the Labor Council was a lot more conservative. And really, they started as an organization that wanted to increase Hispanic influence in public office and in Congress. So what they were looking to do was really increase who could vote, who was registered, what parties or individuals they could support. So it was a lot more conservative in working within the system versus trying to change the system.
Thank you. Yeah. And to touch on you at the end of your presentation, we're kind of discussing the issues of getting Georgia specific. And so do you know if there's any community or governmental infrastructure that existed in Georgia or that region to facilitate legalization for immigrants living here at that time?
Can you just read that? Was it that I didn't find anything archived, but was there another? Okay,
Or
sorry.
do you know of other like infrastructure government entities who existed in Georgia?
Yes, thank you. So in my work, I've only been able to identify one qualified designated entity that worked in Georgia and which was actually fairly regional other than in Florida. And that was the Catholic Social Services of Atlanta, which worked in Atlanta, but also did legalization efforts in Northeast Georgia, in the South Georgia. They extended their work and their training into Alabama, into the Carolinas. And there was very likely, of course, lawyers and other community organizations that, kind of took up this mandate of helping legalization efforts. But as far as a qualified designated entity vetted by and authorized by the INS, it's only been the Catholic Social Services, and I've been able to trace. And I think the fact that they had this like authorization makes it a lot easier to find in the archive.
Yeah, definitely. Roger, I see that you have a hand up. Uh, Go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Well, thank you for that presentation. So interesting. I think the IRCA Act is understudied, which is kind of amazing given what we're seeing today in our world today. And I have a question whether you were able to access or try to access any of the IRCA records generated by naturalization. Because naturalizations, there's a whole process by which these immigrants had to prove that they qualified under it. And there's a process they had to go through. And I wonder where those records went. Because that would be a gold mine for understanding the basis of the immigrant Mexican communities, legal immigrant Mexican communities that emerged in the Deep South in the 80s, and certainly in the area I'm in, Pennsylvania, very important for the mushroom industry here. I'm not sure that, I mean, the National Archives maintains naturalization records, but I'm not sure where the IRCA records are with those because that was a legal process. Do you know anything about that or able to access anyway?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's definitely something I've been trying to identify too. So from I haven't seen these records myself, but just from speaking to other scholars that are also kind of in this IRCA world, it seems that the temporary residency application, so that very initial application that was sent to INS, I believe those records are held at the University of Texas, El Paso. Marta Guerrero Bonillo is on this call, and she could probably say a little bit more about that. But that's as far as I know, that's where they have been. I don't believe that they've been processed. So it's been a matter of like reaching out to the archivist and seeing like what might be available from what I know. But like I said, I haven't seen them myself. And I naturalization records. Yeah, I've looked at, yes, in DC and at the regional office in Atlanta, and I haven't seen anything for that period. So I don't know if they're again just not processed yet or not available. But for me, reaching out to the government entities, so I've also reached out to USCIS. It's been walls. I haven't been able to find anything. So I think maybe looking in university archives or community archives. The University of Stanford also holds the records for the National Council of La Raza, and they were very influential as well in ARCA's passage and in legalization. So I think some information might be available there. Again, that's on my to-do list. Haven't gone there yet, but that might be somewhere worth looking.
And
So,
just to chime in with National Archives, those records might be restricted due to privacy issues.
Mm.
They do sometimes, especially if it has personal identifiable information, might restrict it for 75 years.
Yeah, really good point.
Roger, did you have a follow-up? Or
well, just that I mean the lore. I mean, we have a lot of very large Mexican immigrant population in southern Pennsylvania and Chester County because of the Western business there. And the lore is that the origins of it were the IRFA Act. That you had a lot of immigrants, undocumented working there in the 80s, and a lot of them became legalized by IRFA. And that's generated a very substantial community in that area there. So I think I'm curious as what extent you could prove that or document that. It's a part of this conversation of illegal immigrants and all that, but this is a very large legal population.
all right, Martha, I see that you have your hand raised. If you want to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I can't quite turn my video on because I'm in a little spotty Wi-Fi situation, but hopefully people can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
I'll just touch on that really quickly because Libya and I have had conversations about this. And I think you're absolutely right about when it comes to naturalization records at NARA, there's a hard line, I think 68 or somewhere around it. And there's just no available records because especially privacy concerns, they haven't been unsealed. There's a 25-year restriction for a lot of these records. So it's just not accessible. I also haven't been to UTEP archives yet, but just speaking with other researchers and speaking with the archivist herself, they are on process still, and there are a lot of questions right now about whether it's responsible to make those records available. A lot of identifying information, a lot of people who are still somehow connected to the system, a lot in this political climate, especially like it's just not I think it's a conversation, even as researchers, what our own kind of positionality is to having those kinds of records for people when, these people are going through these processes in the late 80s, right? So I think it's definitely a challenge. I think we definitely have to work responsibly and not, I think it's very easy to get caught up in how interesting and how illustrative those records would be versus kind of managing some of those very real ethical concerns, especially right now, and kind of anonymizing and all of those things. On my own experience, I think even doing interviews right now and oral histories about those processes, it's not something that people necessarily want to talk about right now in the same way I think that before. And it just brings up all these questions about legality and kind of how people are navigating that. But your talk was incredible. Thank you so much for all of that. That was just really, really exciting to see. And I did have a question about just if you've kind of encountered, even within this kind of more macro and kind of institutional conversations that are happening, whether there are distinctions between kind of the pre-1982 applicants and the SAW applicants, whether kind of farm work plays into some of these discussions in terms of who is actually going to quote become legalized, like where these people are kind of located within the workforce. I feel like we have an idea, but I'm just curious kind of whether you've encountered anything regarding like different kinds of applications and kind of how they're understanding the farm work processes versus kind of these people who have been here for a long time. Sorry, that was a long run, but thank you so much for this presentation. Super, super exciting to hear.
Oh, thank you, Martha. Oh gosh, that's yeah, the SAW applicants is a whole thing. From what I've seen just in the records, like there hasn't been a lot of distinction in how the outreach efforts are conducted between those two populations. Like it kind of seems like you qualify, okay, like let's just get the information out. Where I think I've seen a little bit more distinction, or could potentially find distinction is in this issue of labor versus like industrial labor, service labor, and then like farm worker labor. I think that there's an important distinction there in how those populations were, reached in what areas of the country, and the, just all of the barriers that were different for SAW versus for pre-1982. So right, like in a sense, it was easier to qualify in comparison, right? Because you only had to have those 90 days and you just had to have like an employer, kind of say that you did, which of course raises a question of fraudulent applications. But putting that aside, I do think that it was tougher for SAW applicants to be reached, to have this information, and to make it to a legalization office, whether it was a QED or an INS office. I think there was a lot more, it was a lot more difficult for them to be able to do that. That doesn't really answer your question. And like I said, I think I haven't seen too much of a distinction in the outreach efforts to different groups. But it's also because I haven't really focused on applicants. My application or my focus has really been on applicants that have been pre-1982. So if I had perhaps deviated a little more, I could find more. And I think that there is plenty, but got to keep it focused. But thank you for your question.
Cindy, I believe you have a question for us.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, great job, Livia.
Thank you.
That was it was exciting to think of the role of unions in the legalization process. It wasn't something I thought about before. And I wondered whether the unions that participated sort of volunteered, stepped forward, said to their leadership, hey, can we do this? We have lots of immigrant members, we want to participate in this. Or did the AFL-CIO kind of write to its constituent unions and say, hey, you should do this, and only two responded? It seems like a big difference. And the reason I was thinking about this is, historically, for so many generations, the official position of the AFL, it wasn't, you know, the CIO was newer, but of the AFL was sort of hostile to immigration, even though it had immigrant members and a huge swath of the labor force was made up of immigrants. The AFL's position was, you know, we'll be better off if we can close the borders, because then wages will be higher. But I think it's 1990. I remember I was so surprised I pulled my car off the road. The AFL-CIO announced that it was changing its historic policy, calling for immigration restriction, and it was going to reverse course. And the slogan was, we don't care about green cards, we care about union cards. And it was going to organize people regardless of their status. And I remember being absolutely shocked. I mean, this was a change in a long, long policy. But now that I think about it, it's right on the heels of IRCA. Right. And I wonder if this role of unions in helping getting people legal status, and maybe those people really did join unions once they were legal, is that the reason why the AFL would have changed its heart on the issue of immigration?
Yeah, I mean, that was really the question I was trying to answer. And I wasn't able to answer that through the Georgia State Archives, but I think that it's definitely something that is potentially held at the Cornell Kiel, I believe I'm saying that correctly, Kiel Center, where they hold the vast majority of the immigration, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, specifically their immigration project through the end of the 20th century. So I think answering that might require a visit. In terms of other unions that were also part of the effort, so what I was able to find was a lot of them were in California. So I mentioned them in my presentation. So the Amalgamated Clothing and Textiles, United Farm Workers, electrical workers, laborers, and carpenters. So they had very high number of immigrant union members already, and my assumption would be that extended communities included a lot of underdocumented, and perhaps there was an influence there, and they said let's do this as an opportunity to kind of get people legalized, people affiliated with the union. But that didn't happen nationwide, right? So not every union signed up for that. So I don't know. I would imagine it kind of went both ways, between the Federation coming down with, hey, we're supporting this, we're supporting legalization, this is something that you can do. But even out of all of the unions that are affiliated with the AFL-CIO, only the International Lady Workers was the only one that was a QDE. So there's definitely a lot that did not support the effort, but I wonder, why, if it was something like within their chapter, or if it had to do with just trying to get all of the resources together and all of that mobilization ready within those 6 months. Maybe it just wasn't feasible. So yeah, I don't know. I don't have an answer, but I think it's a really great question.
Well, I always wonder to what extent that change in AFL-CIO policy was just from the top, or had it trickled down, to the members? How were members, hostile to this change, and it was really coming from a few people from above? And I don't know the answer to the question, but I wonder if you looked at, just picked a union, one of those that you just mentioned, and read their correspondence or read their newsletter, even, which you should be able to get remotely, and just see what they're saying about immigration at that particular moment, rather than looking for the records of this work. See if you can find some of the correspondence and the thought process around what they thought about IRCA and whether they should get involved.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my challenge there is if I want to continue focusing on the South, whether I'll be able to find that. Yeah, but that's a whole nother challenge.
Yeah. Well, you're in the right archive at the moment, so.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. We do have some of the records from the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers in the archives. It's not overly processed, so you're gonna have to do some digging.
That's okay. Yeah, no, happy to do that. And
Yeah.
I did look through those, but I think I'll have a second look and I'll do more digging. Thank you.
Yeah. Grace, you have a question.
Yeah, thanks. May I also make a comment?
Sure.
Well, I'm sitting here at the AFL-CIO. That's incidentally where I work. And I do have a question, but I wanted to make a comment on the last topic, which is that I would suggest that the governance of these organizations plays a really important role in the how decisions are made, and sort of where they flow to, and that might be something to account for in trying to answer the questions that have been raised here. But I was curious a little bit more about your research methods. Could you describe a little bit more just in terms of like looking into the decision making and the the factors that went into that and that came out of these changes? Could you describe the sources of information again? And I have to admit that I wasn't looking at this screen at the beginning of your presentation, so I'm sorry if you already really went into detail here.
I didn't discuss the sources. I did have the citations, which they're very tiny. So I'm happy to share this presentation out, or the bibliography, whatever might be easier for people to kind of see where I'm coming from. But to answer your question, so most of it came from Georgia State's Southern Labor Archives, particularly the pieces on the Labor Council on Latin American advancement. So I looked at a lot of their pamphlets, their governance documents, their bylaws, some meeting notes, and just kind of what they were doing in the 1980s, which is in the 1970s to an extent, the bulk of where I drew my sources from. But I complemented that as well with documentation from the National Archives. So specifically looking at the subcommittee on immigration from the 100th Congress and the memos and the papers of Alan Simpson. So Senator Alan Simpson, who was one of the architects of IRCA. And the third archive that I drew from is the Catholic University of America, and that was to illuminate the coalition between United States Catholic Conference, the ACLU, and AFL-CIO, and that coalition that had formed throughout the passage of IRCA and then into legalization, particularly as they were influencing the rules and the regulations that came to guide what legalization was and how applicants applied and had their information processed and eventually, got their interview and temporary residency, permanent residency, etc. So that's really what I drew from. I didn't do any oral histories for this project, but I think that might be the next step. And I know there's an oral history conversation happening in the chat, which that has definitely been something that's on my mind and trying to figure out, the oral histories that I have already done prior to all of these administration changes, and if there is a possibility to continue, because I have reached out to a couple of people, applicants, not anybody that was affiliated with a union, but kind of trying to get their sense, what are their thoughts, having just a conversation about everything that's happening. It's always very surprising how people are very open to sharing, and they're not necessarily aware of, how risky, how dangerous it can be given certain moments like the one we're living in now. So I don't know if oral history is going to be something that I can continue to do, perhaps just in my own research and not sharing that publicly. But I think an avenue would be really interesting is to find somebody that was a union member, whether in California perhaps, or in New York or in Texas. And in the interviews that I've done, every single person out of maybe 15 that I've done, except one, was in another state. They did not do their application in Georgia. So, they were elsewhere in California, Texas, and New York and Florida. So I wonder if any of them were affiliated with a union, or if I could find somebody that, kind of did their process with a union or was affiliated with a union and then kind of moved to the South, and what influence that might have had. So that's something to think about.
Well, excellent. Anyone else have any questions for us? If not, we'll start to wrap it up. Oh, yeah.
Your email address,
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put this in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming to our talk. If you are interested in doing research in the Southern Labor Archive, our applications for the 2026 Reed Fink Award is open, and they are due by October 10th. And I'm just going to drop the link into the chat. And so please consider applying. We love to help support our researchers and help them access the Southern Labor Archive.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Cindy, do you have something?
Nope.
And so please join us on November 21st at 1 p.m. for our next Reed Fink talk, White Hot to White Wall, Steel Archives Reimagined. Professor Emily Baker has spent years immersed in industrial archives, from the abandoned remains of the AL Tech in New York to her recent research at Georgia State University Southern Labor Archive. In this talk, she will share how she reimagines historical photographs by layering traditional neon over images of white hot steel. A shifting gradient of color evokes both the cooling decline of the U.S. steel in the 1970s and simulates the intensity of industry while in White Wall Gallery. So look forward to seeing you all on November 21st. Thank you so much.